Welcome to this session of the Cloud Exchange. My guests today are Andrea Fletcher, the Chief Digital Strategy Officer at the Centers for Medicare Medicaid Services, and Remy DeCausemaker, the open source lead, also with CMS. Andrea, Remy, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Thanks for having us, Jason.
Now, this session of the Cloud Exchange continues the discussion around IT modernization, cloud, of course. But Andrea, this is very specific to a new program, if you will, that you all launched maybe 6 months ago, maybe 9 months ago now, around open source. And I remember hearing you speak back in February at a conference where you said, "Hey, we're trying something new. We're throwing some spaghetti against the wall, if you will, around using open source more actively, more progressively in CMS in terms of how to modernize." So let's start at the very beginning. What is the goals of the open source program, and give me a little bit of background.
So Remy and myself have started the first open source program office at a federal government agency. It's a very common type of office or team to stand up at any large software shop. There are OSPOs, we call them OSPOs, in European countries and universities and most large software organizations. And there hasn't been one at a federal government agency. And when we started looking at how CMS builds software, because we build a lot of software at CMS, this seemed like a great opportunity for us to leverage some of our best practices that were already in place. So we have some of the largest bulk FHIR, FHIR, APIs in the world with Blue Button 2.0 and data at the point of care, these really great initiatives that were already underway at CMS, as well as some other fantastic open source projects. And we kind of looked at this as like, how do we do more of that? What do we need in order to push ourselves into the next kind of version of open source at CMS? And that's where the OSPO came into play. Remy, anything you want to add?
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. And one of the goals of open source program offices and just open source in general is including folks who are not just consumers of software, but also contributors. So giving people an opportunity on the outside to contribute to CMS projects, not just by providing feedback, but providing patches, as well as engaging with early career talent pipeline programs like Coding It Forward, the US Digital Core, US Digital Response, and other internship and early career opportunities that help get young technologists and early career professionals into public service.
Interesting that this is the first one. Now, open source, and I went back and looked at the CMS open source policy. It mentions the policy from, I think it was 2021 about federal source code policy. It talks about code.gov. Andrew, why don't you think this was done in government before?
It's a great
when you
question.
say this is the first one, it's fascinating to me. I think that's one of the reasons why I think we're talking.
Yeah, it's been around. So open source policies have been around since the Obama administration. So, going on almost 20 years now for some of these policies. And it's not new. Like open source is not new. This is not a new idea. In fact, I think it's innovative that we have a program office, but building code in the open is how the internet was built. They say 80 to 90% of code that is used today is actually open source. It's the foundation of how we build software. I think what's different now is, especially in the federal government, recognizing that and saying, we're going to use this to our advantage. So rather than ignoring the open source ecosystem, how do we leverage that? How do we make sure it's more secure? And then also, how do we build in the open to basically encourage a better healthcare IT ecosystem. So really looking at this as a mechanism for reaching beyond the government into the immense ecosystem that is healthcare software development.
And one of the things that I've seen over the years is the Defense Department, as an example, has talked about open source. And they've kind of this love-hate relationship with open source. We want to use it, but not so much. What was it like for CMS to kind of get this going? I want to talk about some of the challenges you faced, but when you and Remy first kind of came up with this idea, I'd love to know what that initial reaction is from your hires up.
We had to go on, we called it the roadshow. We had to explain to people what open source is and what it is not, right? So for example, we're not giving away all of our data. We're not opening up all of the PII and putting it out on the internet. That is not what we are doing here. The data is in secure databases and that it's different than the code that we run on the data. I think that was a big, just like dispelling all of the myths around what open source software is and is not. And that took a lot of work. And then once we got that buy-in, I think we've been kind of off to the races. There are some challenges just around how we manage software in general, how we manage GitHub repositories. We have a lot of contractors at CMS. We tend to have contractors siloed within our centers, right? We have multiple centers. And so really trying to break down those silos and work across different components has been part of what the OSPO is attempting to do here. And that's something that's very difficult to do in government. And really, I think one of the main benefits of having an OSPO is actually the inner source collaboration. So being able to collaborate internally, not just with the public, but across CMS components and centers and across HHS and across the federal government. Remy has some great stories about how, work that we've been doing at CMS at one center has been leveraged at another, or even other federal agencies are now using work that was started at CMS in totally different sectors. So completely outside of healthcare, because that's, it's build once, reuse many, and sharing, which in turn ends up saving us time. It ends up saving us money, valuable resources that we don't have enough of. Anything you want to add to that, Remy?
Yeah, specifically shout out to the Department of Defense open source FAQ. That thing has been gathering momentum for many, many years, like a decade longer than even 20 years, I think. I think it's probably approaching 30 now. So that document really helps to dispel a lot of myths and did a lot of the pioneering and groundbreaking work for making it easier for us to make the case for why open source is very normal and very boring inside of the government. It's been happening for a long time. The digital service is all about hiring talented people to do boring work. That's one of the main things that we're trying to do here is to, innovation is exciting, but transformation can be painful, right? So that is something that I've heard Andrea talk about, and it's something she brings to the team that we take when we're going through and reducing burden, reducing costs, reducing duplicate work and effort. These aren't foreign concepts. I think that providing accountability for contractor performance and helping to show metrics and growth around your projects and communities. These are really carrots that we get to bring to our leadership and our product and project teams. So things like providing maturity models and repository templates and playbooks and guidance. We have the authority to operate thanks to executive orders and policies and legislation. But where we come in as an OSPO is we get to provide below that sub-regulatory level that, boots on the ground level guidance to help make engineers' lives easier, to help end users' lives get easier and reduce that burden so that it's easy to comply. One good example of that is our hospital price transparency tool, which was released this past year. CMS put out a new rule saying that hospitals had to have a machine readable list of all of the services and the costs associated with them that they provide. And so rather than building some bespoke custom thing, we built a static open source website that's hosted on the internet where folks can upload and validate their data files, and it will tell them warnings and it will help them to name the files correctly and really helps to fill in some of the gaps where the policy may not have said at that machine readable level what the standards need to be, but we can provide a reference implementation to make it easier for hospitals to comply and make their lives easier for uploading that file. So hospital price transparency tool, github.com/cmsgov/HPT-tool. That is where you can find that. It's up on the internet, and hospitals don't even need to install it locally. They can just go to one website. Everybody can get to it. Everyone can use it. And we've already seen contributions coming in from the outside world. So beyond those types of reusable client-side work that we do, we also have maturity models, repository templates, so that when a contractor or a government agency needs to start from zero, we have 5 tiers of maturity to say where you are in your open source journey, what your goals are, tools to help you identify those pathways, and then these extensible tools where you can start from something instead of starting from nothing. And we've seen folks inside of CMS, our Centers for Clinical Quality and Standards, across our Medicaid, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, and even outside, the Department of Education actually released their first open source repository on GitHub in history. And, we got to see them using those templates and starting from somewhere. So we know that it's valuable inside the agency. We know that it's valuable at the federal level, and we hope that it's valuable wherever folks can get them and use them. So we want to reduce work and effort across the ecosystem.
So much there to follow up with. Andrea, I know you talked about this again at the conference, the vendor side of it, and we're going to get there in a sec. But I want to take a big old step back to something you said, Andrea, earlier on in our conversation. You said the reason maybe why CMS and you all decided to launch this new open source office is how much software development CMS does do. And I think a lot of folks think of CMS as the old mainframe stuck in the COBOL world. So maybe give me just a little bit more background about how much software development does CMS does, and why is open source and this initiative coming at maybe the perfect time for, as you said, the transformation versus all these great innovations that you could do.
Yeah, we've been on a modernization journey for at least 5 years at CMS on the mainframes and the COBOL, which is, we process 4.5% of the US GDP every day through the Medicare claims processing system. We're the largest healthcare payer in the world. And that has really, it was started in the 1960s and has been developed over decades. And really the modernization effort there is not just how do we move from the mainframes to the cloud or to modern, from COBOL to Java, but how do we rework all of the business processes that go along with, the largest claim system in the world. One of the initiatives this year was actually adding a new dental claims form that is kind of currently being tested and released. So CMS for the first time ever will accept the 837D because when you go to a dentist's office, they actually submit a different type of claim to the insurance payer. And so this was kind of a journey for us in how do we do this in a different way, because we don't already accept this claims form. It was a tested modernization. So we actually built that all out in a cloud version and are looking at this as a potentially the future of the claims payment systems at CMS. There's a lot going on there, but that's one center. CMS has, 6 major centers, and many of them are already using, pretty modern tech stacks. Healthcare.gov, for example, has a pretty large cloud instance and processes, millions. It's 34 million people who sign up every year using healthcare.gov, and there are multiple plans that are options for people to purchase, which are coming through. So you just have a lot going on in some of these systems. So, healthcare.gov is one. Medicaid is another major center that we have. Like Remy said, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation. They're all releasing code all the time. They're building new products, building new tools constantly. We have, thousands of contractors who are working with us as well. And that development ecosystem and how we build software, we need to try to get more efficient, right? So not just the legacy, COBOL mainframes, but how we're building custom code, continually, pretty much every day. We have new systems that are being developed or migrated to a new system, and we're a large software shop. I didn't know that when I came into CMS. I didn't realize that. If I'm being honest, I was like, oh, CMS, like Medicare, they process claims payments, but I didn't realize how much software we actually develop. And I think one thing that's really frustrating is whenever we build the same thing twice, because we don't have the resources to do that. We can't build the same thing twice. And it's frustrating for the teams that are building that, hey, we're watching somebody else build the exact same thing. Why aren't we working together? And it's because of funding streams or contracts or something that doesn't really make sense, to be honest. We just want to build it once and be able to reuse it. And so that takes a total mentality shift of like how we build and manage the processes around building software at CMS. Did that answer your question there? Sorry, I went on a tirade, I feel like.
No, it's a great tirade, because I think people, again, the perception of what CMS is or is not kind of gets in front of what you're actually doing. Do you have a sense of, you said you do code every day, new builds. Do you get a sense of how much of your code is built in-house with contractor help, of course? Is it 100%, 99%, or how much you pull off the shelf, or is there no way to?
Yeah, there's a lot of COTS software or software as a service, right? And that's a significant portion of what we do. But because healthcare is so specific, and so much of what CMS is doing is, collecting quality of care data, for example, to make sure that healthcare systems and providers are, up to standards and in compliance with CMS. A lot of that stuff is actually fairly customized, right? And one thing that I think is frustrating both for the healthcare sector and providers and for us is when we play a guessing game of like, what does CMS want, right? And the more transparency that we can have in, hey, these are the algorithms that we're using to determine if you're in compliance or not. Here it is. We put it on GitHub. You too can see this. You can run the algorithm on your data before you submit it to us to make sure that you're in compliance. And also we're going to use, best in class standards for all of this. And so that's the vision. That's where we're headed, is how do we increase transparency in the healthcare sector by being a little bit more open on the CMS side. And that takes guts. That takes a lot of courage, right? Because that means that if we are wrong, like if there's something wrong in our code, somebody can see that and tell us, and we have to make the change, right? And we will get it wrong sometimes, right? There will be an error, there will be a bug. It's code. There's always bugs in the code. But that level of transparency, like Remy was talking about the hospital price transparency tool, for example, we got software engineers who are working on this in the private sector with hospitals tell us, hey, there's a bug in your code, and send a pull request. And then everybody gets that bug fixed. And there's a total transparency there of, because CMS put it out there, that other people can actually look at it and see it and try to understand it. And that process to me is like, I mean, that's incredible for the healthcare sector and for the government in general.
Let's jump into the program a little bit deeper. Remy, as the open source lead, what did it take to develop a program like this? What were the pieces and parts you had to put together? You mentioned GitHub repository several times. Walk me through, because I think since this is not maybe done before in the government, we may have a lot of people who are going, okay, I want to do that. What do I need to do to get started?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We luckily are not the first ones to do an open source program office, even though it's the first time it's being done in the public sector in the United States at a federal agency. So folks like in Europe, in the EU, the European Commission has had an OSPO for almost 10 years now. The World Health Organization has as well. Private sector companies have a trade association called the To-Do Group, todogroup.org, where there is a guidebook, open source program office 101, the open source program office definition. There are a lot of resources on the outside where we can look to those industry best practices and then model the work that we're doing from that, so that we're not starting from scratch. And luckily, I have been fortunate enough in my career to be part of a number of open source program offices at academia, as well as private sector, Silicon Valley, nonprofits. So this is proverbially not my first rodeo at standing up one of these. So based on that, and the beautiful thing about being an open source is that all of that work is public, right? So we can all boats rise with the tide. So as long as we're sharing our best practices in work, organizations like the To-Do Group, as well as the CHAOSS community, so CHAOSS.community, stands for the Community Health and Analytics of Open Source Software. They are part of the Linux Foundation, and they're a freestanding foundation that brings together folks like myself who are big nerds for metrics and data around open source communities and projects. So we just got back from Open Source Summit North America in Seattle, where we co-presented alongside other members of that OSPO metrics working group. So the ideas of repository cohorts and how do we categorize the different projects that we have. We presented our maturity model, which I previously spoke about, but we also have other templates and repo scaffolder tools that are available on GitHub. So really, when we think about our open source strategy, it's from two angles. We're looking to raise the floor for all of the open source projects across the CMS ecosystem. And then we're also looking to raise the ceiling for our existing open source projects who are looking for specific guidance and specific goals that they have on increasing adoption or increasing their contributor and developer community. So, by taking both of those work streams into account and thinking about inbound code, that is code that comes into the agency that we depend on from the outside, and outbound code, that is code that we share with the outside world. Everything in an OSPO sort of falls into those two work streams. And then whether or not we're raising the floor or the ceiling, we get to figure out sort of how to best allocate our limited resources to help our big existing open source projects and build from the ground up to support everyone and raise their digital standard of living.
Let's talk about the impact the open source is having on CMS projects so far. What kind of metrics are you using? How are you dealing with some of the, hey, is this really making a difference? Are we really seeing benefits from open source? Remy, do you want to start, maybe talk a little bit about the measures you use?
Sure, yeah. So a lot of the baseline measurements that people use for open source communities revolve around where the code is hosted and who is contributing to it. So we have a public metric site. It is available on the internet. Anybody can look at it. We are still in the early phases. We just released version 1 at Open Source Summit North America just last week. It tracks very baseline metrics or things like number of commits, number of pull requests and issues. Those are like people who are identifying issues in a project, and then people who are sending patches to solve those issues in a project. Commits are the number of patches and contributions that are made by contributors. We track the number of contributors, but also from a customer experience and developer experience standpoint, how long it takes for us to respond to those initial issues. How long does it take before a project patch that is sent in becomes merged into production? So those are the kinds of, velocity metrics that we keep in mind when we're looking at the health of open source communities. We are also, of course, like I said, interested in that inbound software supply chain security stuff. So we're using the OpenSSF scorecard. They are a big open source security foundation that is out there helping out, working with organizations and agencies like the Cyber Security and Infrastructure Security Agency to establish standards in wake of the Log4j vulnerability that happened a few years ago, and is part of the Open Source Software Security Initiative out of the Office of the National Cyber Director at the White House. So OpenSSF is a foundation effort. They have the scorecard with a dozen plus metrics for your open source projects, whether or not you're validating user input, whether or not you're fuzzing your project to check whether or not you're vulnerable to fuzzing attacks, whether or not you have an established release cadence and a release process so that when things are released, they're done in a timely way, how your project repository structure is built out. All those things are one aspect we keep track of. Another tool that's in our toolbox that we use is called RepoLinter. RepoLinter is part of a to-do group. They maintain that project, and it basically just is a tool for checking for common issues inside of open source repositories. So our maturity model says if you're a tier 3 project that's working in public, you need to have, out of these 8 files, you're going to need 6 of them. And inside of this 6 files here, they should have these 10 sections in this one and these 12 sections in that one. So we had that as sort of a self-service tool where people have to read the documentation. But thanks to contributions from the open source program office at Comcast, we actually have a RepoLinter config now that maps out each of our sections in the repository and can say whether or not a certain section is there or isn't. And that script can be run before you commit the project, or it can be run after you commit to the project. So we can use it to post hoc, look at whether or not repositories are meeting those metrics and standards, or we can do it pre-commit so that we can ensure that those projects are adhering to those standards and the metrics look good before that code goes out into the public. And we can run that in continuous integration and deployment environments so that it is run in an automated way. So good is having standards, better is having assistance, best is automating that stuff so that we get those metrics and we can track that programmatically across our ecosystem.
Remy, I'm glad you brought up the security side. We got to talk about security when it comes to open source. Andrea, was that the hardest piece of this to convince folks, hey, we can do this, this is beneficial for us? Well, what about security? You mentioned, people's initial myth busting of, oh, we'll put PII everywhere, it's going to go across the world, and you had to kind of downplay, you had to kind of dispel that myth.
So I think when we talk about cybersecurity and open source, particularly with open source program this is a tool that we can have actually to improve our cybersecurity posture. One thing that I don't think this is uncommon to CMS, but one thing that I noticed whenever we've seen things like Log4j happen is essentially what happens is CMS puts a letter out to our contractors and we have them attest whether or not they have this vulnerability. And we are basically trusting people's word. If they say no, we're trusting them that they do not have it. The challenge with that is that not everyone knows. And not everyone is capable of really fully being able to understand their software bill of materials. We see this constantly with these different vulnerabilities. And so like what Remy was talking about with automation is being able to automate as much of that as possible, right? Being able to know what code is in our code. I don't know if that's the correct way, but like being able to know what's in our code across the entire ecosystem is huge, because we can say, hey, look, we found Log4j here, push the patches out, push the updates out throughout all of our systems, throughout all of the software that we're building. We're able to basically be a little bit more organized about where our software is, where our code is, and see the vulnerabilities and fix them faster, rather than going through this attestation process, which is slow. It can take, weeks to months, and it's really not, it's code. So we can run code on our code and see these vulnerabilities faster, and we should be doing that. So it's more about how do we organize ourselves to be able to react faster when we're in a cybersecurity incident. And what does that mean for an agency like CMS, to have basically visibility into where our vulnerabilities are that we haven't had before. And I think that's like one of the things that makes me really excited about something like the open source program office is having better visibility across our tech stack to be able to say, we know where our vulnerabilities are and we're actively fixing them or getting ahead of them before, we find out months later that we actually did have this situation. And I don't think that's uncommon for other federal agencies either. I don't think we're alone in this. There's a lot of conversations happening around software bill of materials. What are we buying? What's in what we're buying? How do we know what's in the software? And this actually gives us more transparency in what we've got.
Let me take a half step back, because I love the fact the way you described the benefits and the security was making that case to your higher ups more difficult than you expected, or the way you explained it to me. I'm on board with Andrea. Let's do it. Let's use more open source, right? That was an easy to get on board. But how hard was to convince the lawyers, the cybersecurity folks? And
I don't think it was I think it was pretty easy at CMS. Our CISO, who has now moved on, Rob Wood, had already been building an open source, it's called an SBOM harbor, but a software bill of materials harbor, because this is a common issue that we see. And so we've been trying to get ahead of this for a while. And I think CMS has been kind of leading in that for quite a bit, actually. And it wasn't that hard for us to convince people. I don't know, Remy, maybe you have a different opinion, but it seemed like everyone was like, all right, thumbs up, let's go. We need to know what's in our code.
Yeah, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, this would have been, the first time. But, thanks to, the executive orders that came out in the mid 2000s, plus, the AI executive order, plus the 21st Century Idea Act, there are a variety of executive orders, regulations, and legislation that already says on the books, open source is A-OK, and people have been using it to solve problems at the federal level for decades at this point. So really the question is whether or not you're going to have an intentional strategy to deal with that, or whether you're going to, be sort of at the whim of what happens. And, software isn't just made of code, it is made of people. So a big part of securing these communities is helping people find each other, helping to break down silos, helping to increase the information flow in between different communities, helping people know who the project leaders are, giving them a place to gather and discuss and share their information. So a lot of the initiatives out of the Open Source Software Security Initiative at the Office of National Cyber Director is developing like JCDCs and these sort of like bat phone environments where private industry and public sector can come together when there is a new vulnerability. XZ is a really prominent security vulnerability that just came out recently. I think I'm, contractually obligated to address it because it was even in the New York Times, and I was surprised to see it in the major press. But that was basically a social engineering attack where folks were taking advantage of overworked and burnt out maintainers to sort of bully them into letting them commit to the project and changing important files. So, automating these kinds of checks with things like repo-linter enable us to do things like, let's watch this file and make sure that the contact addresses don't change. That's one of the ways that attack was executed, was that the attacker changed the email address where people would send their security reports to their own personal email address. And alarm bells did not go off when that happened. So, even in just learning from these things as they're coming out and learning from that, and we share it as a government community and say, here's the post-mortem or even the mortem, right? It's not even done yet. This attack is still being investigated and is, being understood across the ecosystem, but we're learning from those things in real time because agencies are sharing information with CMS. CMS is sharing what we have. Our associates are developing our, one-pagers that we can share inside the agency based on national strategy, based on private sector analysis. So, these tools we're looking to build and customize in real time to try and address these emerging threats as they come forward. So a stronger community helps to secure against these social engineering attacks. Automated tooling helps to detect them when they come through. And like Andrea said, that reduces the cycle time to response and can help to reduce the blast radius in the case of an incident.
Remy, I appreciate the two things you said here. Hey, if this was new, maybe it was a harder sell, but it's been around for a long time. And there's a lot of policy regulations, orders that say, hey, open source is okay. But I really also enjoyed software is not just made up of code, it's made up of people. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that piece to it. The other side of the coin is because we're talking here at the Cloud Exchange, the fact is we're all much more comfortable with cloud, with the DevSecOps environment, the tools that go into that environment. Is that the other piece here, or why open source people maybe have a less consternation about it, or actually much more comfortable, is because of what we've seen over the last 5, 7, 10 years with the cloud?
Yeah, I would say so. And even with, software as a service, there's governance bodies that are stood up inside of our agency and at other agencies that are now, attestation, like Andrea said, is not the entire picture, but, it is required as of executive orders of this past 2 years that even the SaaS providers are providing attestation in the case of a breach, or they can provide an SBOM when it's asked for. So the cloud, even when it's stuff that's not hosted here and it's software as a service, there are already open source security best practices that are baked into that. I think we're watching sort of a leapfrog of policy because of the cloud strategy. So now the AI executive orders include things like algorithmic transparency and ethics training for your developers. And, we have a trusted playbook at the Department of Health and Human Services that we can work with. AI.gov has a list of all the case studies of where all the other agencies are using AI in the cloud and otherwise. So really it's a lot shorter loop and in complying with this stuff. And that is in large part thanks to the work that's been done in the cloud over the previous decade or so.
Andrea, I want to dig a little deeper into the impact of the open source office at CMS. Do you have any use cases? I know Remy did offered a really good one earlier, or any statistics or examples of how deep open source is. It's you guys, again, just about a year into it. You had a lot of disparate efforts going on. Have you seen those efforts come together? What's the impact of your office been over the last year?
That's a great question. I'll let Remy talk about actual numbers. One of the things that I think is the most impactful, speaking of people, is the fact that we've been able to bring in some early career talent into the OSPO. So we have 2 digital core fellows right now, and 2 more arriving in the next 2 months. They're arriving this summer. We've had 3 Coding It Forward fellows last summer. We'll have 3 more this year, and we're starting our partnership with Code in the Schools. CMS is up in Baltimore Woodlawn area, and Code in the Schools is a program for Baltimore students. Because a lot of this work doesn't need to be, you know, your most senior architects, right? We call it janitorial work. This is good stuff for kids to scrub in on, right? If you're early career, this is perfect for you to come in and get hands-on keyboards immediately. This is good work for students who, because it's open, can then share their work whenever they go back to school or continue their work in the future. And that's been, I think, one of the biggest successes is actually bringing in young talent and seeing that a, you know, entry-level software engineer can do just mountains of work very quickly by working through, you know, the backlog that the OSPO has pulled together. And that's actually what I'm most proud of with all of this is just how this works for us as a recruiting tool for bringing and you know, step one is kind of like the interns, the fellows, the Fed employees, but also new organizations that want to contract with us, right? New different types of businesses that can work in this ecosystem that we haven't been able to work with before. So really just thinking differently about who is building software at CMS and where, like, how they're doing that, right? But Remy can give you some metrics on maybe some of the repos.
Yeah. So Isaac and Natalia, super shout out. Our digital core fellows have been absolutely amazing. Just for this past quarter, they started in September, so they've been here about 8 months. And since then, they have shipped 3 major projects for us. Our repository scaffolder tool, our metrics models and website, as well as our repo linter tools, along with some contributors. So that's on our end. You know, we had 0 public GitHub repositories before the summertime of last year. Our Coding It Forward fellows shipped 7 repositories over the course of 4 months, including to cms.gov, our main open source GitHub organization. And then beyond that, we're averaging probably 1 or 2 agency-led or contractor-led open source projects per month. So the measure calculation tool, which was developed by contractors along with our CCSQ here at CMS, is a proof of concept, a reference implementation for, like Andrea was saying, like, this is how CMS is determining shared savings. So we put it out in the open. We work with the FIRE community to launch that. We actually provided that as a community project. It has left the nest at CMS, and it has left the nest from our contractors, and is now an open source project that's part of the CQ framework GitHub organization. So folks can contribute to that, work on that, use it as a reference implementation to better understand how CMS is determining these numbers and working on it. At the NACO Spring conference, we launched or released a version 1 of a tool called Deduplifier, which helps ACOs to determine, to do some patient matching and record validation work. One of the shared savings programs is ECQM. So ACOs submit 3 metrics, blood pressure, blood sugar, and depression screening. And they track the longevity, longitudinally rather, over the course of their patient populations. And one of the challenges of that is matching and deduplication of the records. So we did user listening sessions. We did some user research. We heard loud and clear that ACOs were having trouble with this. So our team did a proof of concept where we showed off a prototype of what it might look like. And then after we did some more listening sessions with ACOs, released a backend library that uses it uses a new to us ML library called Splink that was developed by the UK government, actually, as part of their national health services. So we are using international open source software from another national healthcare association or administration in another government. And we use that to be the ML brains that is behind our patient matching and duplication. So by leveraging open source software like that, we can provide a reference implementation for our users in our community. And then folks, we just released that a couple weeks ago. So This is just what's been happening in the last 8 months, right?
So
We are still building. We will see what the impact looks like from here, but we're happy to be shipping code.
so let's get down to brass tacks. So because is open source having the impact you had hoped for on CMS and software builds? Remy, everything you went through is great, but if I'm not in the community, I'm going, okay, that's a little bit of foreign language to me.
It's a lot of acronyms.
Exactly. And if, so for the average listener, average watcher of this interview here, is open source having that impact you had hoped for, or is it starting to? How do you measure that?
It's a culture shift, right? Like it's a culture shift that we're going to share code, because we also CMS relies a lot on contractors, right? So we're going to share code across contractors. That's a culture shift. We're about 1 year into the culture shift. So what did somebody say the other day? 1 minute into a 90-minute match. So that's where we're at right now. And I think it's starting to change. We have a lot of work to do. Like, I'll be honest, we have a long way to go around here, but you can see the culture shift starting to happen, right? One of the reasons we've been talking about this a lot is because we need the larger ecosystem that we work with. So all of the centers and offices, we've got task force and things like that running now on open source, where we're working on how we're writing this language into our contracts. We're working on how we're actually taking code that is not open and getting it into repos in the right way. And like Remy said, making sure we have our templates in place and going through, there's a lot of training that has to happen on here's what the maturity model is. This is how this is going to work. Here's all the tools you need. A lot of this is happening, kind of in ad hoc conversations, but then we've also been organizing ourselves through governance processes, like the task force that we have running. We also have a senior governance board on all of this, where, basically the more we say open, CMS is building software open source, let's go. We're kind of rallying the troops right now is what it feels like.
No, I think that's helpful, because I think those are the boring but important, going back to something you said about transformation can be boring. Those pieces and parts
Painful.
have to have that impact. And I'm so glad you brought up the industry, because at the event that you spoke at, that I first approached you about doing this conversation, you said something that I just want to read back to you. It's not the direct quote, but it says something. Yeah, good guy says, we're realizing who our good partners are. CMS is here to serve people, so we want them to be part of the transformation. If we ask you to put your code in GitHub, we mean it. We bought it, we paid for it, and we want to share it. Stop hiding it because you think it's yours. So I'm going to ask you to nail that.
I said that. Yeah.
Yeah, you said
Stop
that.
hiding it. Yeah, I mean, unless it's specifically negotiated, CMS owns the code that our contractors write. Like, it's very clearly written in the contracts. And I think that is part of the struggle that we face is, contractors not having it in the CMS enterprise GitHub, for example, right? And really working with our contracting community. We've had contractors who didn't know what GitHub was, right? Which is it's a pretty standard tool for developing software now. And really just working with our contracting community to say, this is the way that we're going to do this now. And we're building the templates and the tools to make this a carrot and not a stick. This should be exciting. How do we make this something that people want to do, rather than CMS is forcing us to behave this way? But we have an opportunity to take what is a multi-billion-dollar software shop in the federal government and turn it into something, really incredible in terms of what we're producing for the healthcare sector. If we go this route, and it's a culture shift. But yeah, I love that quote. You can repeat it. You can, but yeah, it was bought and paid for by the American people with taxpayer dollars. It belongs to the American people, and we, as stewards of that code, are going to be good stewards of it. And that's the plan for CMS moving forward.
I think that's the best place to end this conversation. It's a good message, and I think folks need to understand it. And we love the idea that everything's a cultural shift in this, but this is having a real impact. So let me say thank you both for your time today. And this is unfortunately all the time we have for this session of the Cloud Exchange. Andrea Fletcher is the Chief Digital Strategy Officer at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Andrea, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
And Remy DeCausemaker is the open source lead, also with CMS. Remy, thank you as well.
Yep, thank you for having us.
I'm Jason Miller, and you're watching Federal News Network. Now let me send you back to the studio for more from the Cloud Exchange.